What's your worst date story? Write in the comments what you think about it. Enjoy the show. Story 1. It was cold outside, around 30 degrees, and we were going out. This wasn't our first date either. We had been dating for a couple of weeks. Well, I go to pick him up, and he's wearing a beanie with a matching scarf. I thought it was super cute and loved how they matched, so I complimented him on them. He then proceeded to talk about how his ex-girlfriend made them for him. I wasn't upset or mad, just caught off guard, lol. Well, I guess my compliment opened a can of, I miss my ex, because that's all he talked about that night, and was basically on the verge of crying at one point. I felt very weird and uncomfortable. I eventually dropped him off back at his place and immediately blocked his number and blocked him on all my socials. Story 3. I went out with this guy who grew up in Europe and emigrated to the US at age 17. He was very clingy and handsy right from the moment we met. We originally met on a dating site and eventually met up at a local cafe. I didn't like that, and after I brought it up, he didn't stop, so I just ghosted him after that. About 2 weeks later, I got a call from a police officer saying he was doing a wellness check because the guy had walked into the police station saying he thought something must have happened to me. The officer and I had a laugh about it, and he said he'd tell the guy what was up. That one still makes me shake my head. Story 4. My first and only date other than with my now boyfriend. It was me and the guy's junior year, and he came and picked me up and went to a town 45 minutes away to get dinner since we live in a very rural area. I'm a naturally awkward person, but he was 10 times more awkward than me, so I had to carry the conversation. Then we went to the movies, and his personality completely switched. He went to flirty and touchy, so I got very uncomfortable and said I had to use the bathroom. So when I was in there, I called my brother to come pick me up, and he did and took me home. A couple of months after that, we were both in a class together, and a girl asked him, "*********, why don't you have a girlfriend?" And he looked straight at me and said, "All the girls I like don't like me back. Best first date I could ever have." Story 5. I had been seeing this girl for a few weeks. I invited her to come with a group of friends and I to a club. One of my friends brought her cousin who was visiting from out of town. I don't like dancing, so I just kinda sipped my drink by myself while she danced with my friends. At some point, she comes over to me and tells me she split her pants dancing and asked me to take her home to get a change of clothes. She lived across town, but what choice did I have? So I drove her all the way to her place and all the way back to the club. She put a skirt on this time, so no worries about splitting her pants again. Back at the club, I lost track of her. The bar announced last call and I still didn't know where my date was. I started looking for her and the place was closing, so it was time to go. I finally found her on the other side of the club, making out with my friend's cousin. I was furious, but I'm not a violent person, so I just told her we gotta go. She was too drunk to talk about what happened, so it was an awkward drive to my friend's after party and then another awkward drive taking her home. I think that was the last time I saw her. Story 6. While I was a university student, I met this girl from another class and I liked her. I asked her out on a date. It was a lovely summer's day, so I took her to the best pizza place in town. The date was going well. Halfway through the date, a friend of mine noticed us, came to our table and sat down. She then proceeded to berate me and badmouth me in front of my date, as if she was my girlfriend or something, even though she had never shown any kind of interest in me. We were just friends. Anyway, my date saw it as a red flag and we never had a second date. I cut ties with my friend after that. She was an asshole. Story 7. Met a girl off of Instagram when I was living in New York. She was cool, and all in the beginning we went out for drinks, and she got sloppy drunk. So once I saw her stumbling, I brought her back to my place to let her sleep it off because it was already 4 a.m. So I head to bed, and that morning I heard a stumbling noise in my kitchen, and this girl was half naked peeing on my windowsill, and I said, "WTF are you doing?" And she replies, "I'm using the bathroom," while chuckling. So at this point, I just called a cop and took some cash out of her purse and sent her back home. Worst online date I have ever had in my entire life. Story 8. I liked this girl at university and I asked her out. She came to the restaurant with 3 of her friends. They mostly talked among themselves, uninterested in me. Then all of these women proceeded to order the most expensive stuff on the menu, one of which was a €130 bottle of wine. I knew where this was going, so I faked that I had to take an urgent phone call from my dad, went to the waiter, paid for my salad, took my main course to go and left. I'm in my car ready to leave and 2 of her friends come out of the restaurant, raging. I smiled at them, peeled out and left. Story 9. This takes me back. I have 2 and they happened within a month of each other. First, met up with a guy I'd been talking to for a while and we went to a state park. As we drove to the other side of the park, he blasted angry rap as loud as his car would allow. I like rap, but I also like to chat. We went to a quieter area of the park and hung out at a picnic table. That's when he told me some fun stuff. First tried to convince me that he was deep undercover with a federal agency he couldn't name and had to blast music to keep up appearances in case any of his targets saw him. Yep, seriously. Then it got even more fun. He told me all about his son, who he had forgotten to mention, and the mom who he was still completely in love with, even though she was married, and not to him. And he wanted me to counsel him, basically, and help him through things. All set with that. The cherry on top was him falling asleep and snoring at the picnic table. I took the opportunity to go for a quiet and peaceful walk, alone. Second, went for dinner with a guy I'd been talking to. He spent most of the dinner telling me all about the, again, married woman that he was totally in love with, and, again, asking my advice on it and looking for counseling. I asked if he was getting therapy, and he was. When we left the restaurant and headed for our cars, he stopped on the sidewalk to point out a nearby hotel and told me his entire story of a suicide attempt in a room on a particular floor, and that he had decided if he couldn't have his married GF all to himself, he didn't want to be here anymore. It was a lot for a first and only date. I'm also realizing younger me attracted some weird dudes, and I was entirely too patient with the weirdness. Story 10. Met a guy for a cool local hike we both wanted to try. Guy's profile online has him 1 year older than me, and he did look approximately so. Should be a mature adult in his late 30s, right? Nope. Starts showing signs of letting his emotions get ahead of him, thinking with his little head, wanting to hold hands and get kissy. When I indicated I'm slow to think about that kind of stuff. We pick up something from a grocery on the way back into town for dinner. He keeps wandering off, leaving the shopping cart diagonal across the aisles. I get home and his college degree is on the wall listing his graduation date as 9 years ahead of what should be based on his stated age. He admits he is actually 9 years older than previously stated, and in conversation during dinner, shows all kinds of racist attitudes. Yep, big winner. Story. 11 years ago, I connected with a girl on Match. We started talking and messaging, and because our schedules conflicted, we talked a bunch before we were able to get a first date. We met in a public parking lot before I drove us to a nearby bowling alley and then a restaurant. She spent most of the date ragging on everyone, random people nearby, her parents, her co-workers, her friends, and so on. She just so much negativity for everyone in her life. The only positive thing about someone besides me she said all night was a backhanded compliment about her sister. On the way back to her car, we passed a neighborhood her best friend lived in, and yup, more insults were thrown. I can't remember anything specific because it was a long time ago, but none of them came across as jokes at all, even if some of them were framed that way. When I got home, I checked our past messages and I couldn't find anybody she'd ever said a positive thing about. I had previously chalked it up to her needing to vent and didn't realize how pervasive it was. I decided there'd be no second date, even though I had had fun and it seemed like there might a connection there. I didn't need that much negativity in my life, and it made me wonder about the compliments she paid me, as the sweet things she said to me were completely at odds with how she perceived everyone else in her life, and even random bystanders. I guessed that she'd tear me down behind my back just like she had everyone else. At the end of a date with another girl, she backed into my car as we were both leaving the parking lot after the date. Didn't even look back and ignored my panicked honking as she pulled out of her space while I was driving past. Story 12. A guy who was somewhat of a regular at a cafe I used to work at asked me out. He was my age and seemed nice, so I agreed. He took me to see The Joker at the movie theater, and I kid you not, he did not stop talking for a single second during the movie. He also kept showing me pictures on his phone of random memories, like a picture of a huge bag of weed one of his friends bought one time. Like, why would I care at all? And also, we are watching a movie right now. After 30 minds, I asked if we could leave because I could endure no longer. Story 13. She stood me up, met on an app, talked for a few weeks, which included texts, video chat, phone calls, Snapchatting each other, and her sending me nudes. She lived about 2 hours away, but we decided to meet in person at this resort that's halfway between us. I make reservations and I clarify with her, and she says yes. Mind you, it wasn't cheap. The day of the meetup, I drive over an hour and get to the place. Before I check in, I clarify with her again because I couldn't get a refund after. She said on her way. Waited almost 2 hours and she still never shows up. I text her and I'm left on read. I try calling and straight to voicemail. 6 hours later, after having a few drinks, I text her, "What happened? Are you okay?" She responds with, "Hey there, cutie," and then says, "Yeah, I'm fine, LOL. I asked her, WDF, why didn't you show? And all she said was LOL. I was going to send a nasty message, but ended up erasing and just blocking. If she got cold feet, she should have just told me she can't make it. especially since she knew it wasn't cheap and I couldn't get a refund. Plus, driving an hour wasting gas money too. If she did this for her own amusement, who the fuck gets gratification from doing that to someone? Story 14. I'd met a guy on a dating app and felt that we hit it off quite well. We messaged a lot, had video chats, and played online games together. This was during the COVID times, and after lockdown had been lifted, we decided to go out on a date, even though social distancing and the other COVID-related stuff was still happening. We decided to meet up in our capital city where he lived, and I only live a 20-minute train ride away from. When I arrived at where we had arranged to meet outside of the train station, he wasn't there. I wasn't going to wait too long for him, but thought I'd wait for a little bit just in case. He then phoned me and asked me where I was. Turned out that he was waiting further up the road away from the station. I walked over to him and saw that he was wearing a dirty, old, scruffy raincoat that had black marks all over it with the waterproof layer peeling off. Definitely not first date attire, but I put it to the back of my mind. He asked if I wanted to get a drink, to which I responded, yes, please. He then said, great, we'll go to this Starbucks over here because I know it's COVID secure. The Starbucks in question wasn't allowing people to sit in, but you had to queue, and only so many people could be in there at one point. When we were stood inside, my date suddenly pulled out a bottle of antibacterial gel and proceeded to smother his hands with it. He must have seen me notice it because he said, oh, don't worry about this. I'm a hypochondriac, so I was doing this way before COVID. I do it all the time. I was like, okay. But that combined with the scruffy clothes just made me think, When we got our drinks, he asked, shall we go for a walk in the park? I accepted the offer. However, it wasn't a nice, leisurely stroll. Instead, it was a full-blown power walk with very boring conversation. I found this confusing, as we had had great conversations online. At one point, I needed to retie my shoelace. My date was talking, but I didn't hear what he said properly, so I looked away from my shoe and up at him, and he was looking at me with an expression of pure disgust on his face. I don't think he expected me to look at him at that point and catch it, but I did. I knew at that point that there was no way that this was going to work, as I clearly disgusted him. After power walking a little further, I suddenly needed to go to the toilet. When I said that I needed to go to the toilet, he said that he did too, and we power walked to the park toilets. They were locked due to COVID, so we ended up power walking through the park, out a side entrance, and then he took me on a weird power walk around some back streets. At this point, I started getting anxious because this was the first time I'd met this guy in person. The vibe was off. And now here he was, leading me down some secluded, empty back streets. We found a pub, but that was locked up because COVID, and we ended up power walking along more empty back streets until we got back to the park and decided to head to the shopping center. The toilets there were open. I felt extremely bored and looked at my watch. It was 12:15. I'd met him at 11:05. After we both used the toilet, he asked, shall we go for another drink? I said yes, and he led the way. We ended up power walking back to the same COVID-secure Starbucks as before. He then led the way again on our walk, so I just power walked and followed his lead. He said, I won't be able to stay out much longer as I'm meeting the boys for football at 1, and I have to get home and get ready. I knew then and there that he wasn't enjoying the date either, because if you're going on a date with someone, why still arrange to see your mates? Or, if you had already arranged to see your mates, you would go on the date a different day. It was clearly a lie and an excuse to leave. Then, a couple of minutes later, I realized that he was leading us back to the train station, subtle as a sledgehammer. We sat on a bench outside the train station to finish our drinks, and he started telling me about his health in quite in-depth detail and about how he has epilepsy. I could tell that he was using it to try and put me off him, and the look of panic on his face when I told him that my uncle has epilepsy and that witnessing seizures and helping people when they are having seizures is completely normal to me was priceless. When it got to 1 p.m., he said that he had to go, even though he was supposed to be meeting his friends at 1 p.m. after going home and getting ready. So I said, enjoy football, and pretended that I didn't know that it was an obvious lie. In doing so, I unintentionally caught him out because he was like, what? Looked really confused, realized what he said, then was like, oh, yeah, thanks, then left. We met up at 11:05. I was on the train home by 1:30. Story 15. Went on a double date during the winter with a guy I'd met before and was on crutches because of a broken ankle or something. I met him, his roommate, and his roommate's fiancée outside my apartment in a little rundown sedan. We had meant to go out to some attraction out in the middle of nowhere. This was Idaho, and again, I knew him, so I didn't feel unsafe about him or his friends. It was about 40 degrees Fahrenheit. about 4 in Celsius, and the car got stuck in some almost frozen mud. By the time we got it out, with the help of some farmers who came by, thank goodness, and after unsticking the doors, we got back in the car only for them to pull over again and suggest we do those paper lantern things in the freezing cold and wind. Long story short, a lantern almost burned down the car and a tree. The bumper came off the car. They wanted to make hot chocolate but had forgotten cups, then wanted to do tie-dye. I said no, went home and took like an hour-long boiling bath. Story 16. We met at the gym. We had our one and only date before I would call her over, but she told me many things that was just a huge red flag for me. Like how she would tell her parents and grandparents that she lost her virginity with me. But the icing on the cake was that she also told me future plans where we would travel together. And since it all started as a hookup for me, these were huge red flags. I just wanted to go with the flow and see where things go. I have never had a one-night stand before, and we can barely call this one that. So I'm really not the person that just fucks around. At the time, I lived at my parents' house, but they were on a vacation, so it was the perfect time to call her over. We were watching a movie, but since I had my doubts, I really didn't push things, so she teased me a bit by grinding her private parts to me. It was super effective, but after that, she haven't said or done anything. So after all the teasing she did online and verbally, it really was quite a letdown seeing her literally aff-king through the whole foreplay. So as I was slowly losing interest and since my brain was once again available, I started reconsidering all the stuff she was planning for us before anything would have happened. It just wasn't worth it. So I made a decision that if she wouldn't do anything more than that little rubbing she gave me, we would just have a very, very awkward sleepover. Yeah, it became exactly that. Story 17. Had the craziest day at work, had literally saved a dude's life for the first time, like CPR and everything, and then dealt with a bunch of medics and cops on my own before my coworkers had even arrived yet. So my second date with this guy was immediately after work. Still a bit traumatized, and I start telling him this crazy thing that happened, and he goes, "Oh yeah, a bunch of your clients probably do drugs, huh?" It was an overdose. And then he just starts talking about his very normal and boring day doing coding or some kind of tech bullshit. The rest of the date he continued with about the same level of interest in me or anything I said, including providing suggestions for my life that were directly contradictory to things I'd just told him. I feel like this guy should have just been dating himself. He was clearly not interested in anything about me at all. Story 18. Went out with one woman I matched with on an app who I initially thought was just sarcastic with a dry sense of humor. Turned out she was just a nihilist. She claimed she wasn't depressed or anything. She was very matter-of-fact and just didn't think there was a point in living past your 50s. By the end of the date, I couldn't really tell what was going to happen, but she gave me her number. Weirdly, she ended up unmatching me, so I just assumed she wasn't interested, so I deleted her number. Then a couple months later, she texts me asking to go out again. But since I had deleted her number, I had to ask who was texting, but then she was like, never mind. Story 19. Met a girl at a baseball game. We hit it off and decided to go out. We talked on the phone a few times, and about a week later, I took her out to lunch. We were sitting at lunch. She was very quiet and seemed uninterested. I asked her if everything was okay. I felt like she wasn't into me, and that's when she had told me that her aunt died the day before and that she had to travel in the morning to visit her family. I didn't know what to say. I apologized and asked her if she wanted to do this another time. She said no, but we can go up to my place and hang out while I pack. After lunch, went up to her place. She started packing while I hung out on her couch. When she was done, she sat next to me and started to make out with me. We ended up getting into her bed. I went downstairs, trying to be PG. We fell asleep, and the next morning she woke up early, took a shower, and was walking around naked while I got my stuff together. She was so sexy, but nothing ever came of it. I guess in the end it was a good date, LOL. Story 20. Wasn't even really bad, all things considered. But she was smoking hot, didn't seem very bright. She told me multiple stories of how she got into car wrecks, but overly clarified details of each wreck to describe how they were never her fault. One wreck involved a chicken truck running a stop sign at a four-way stop. The collision split open the chicken truck, and the chickens were running all over the road. Just the kind of vivid detail that makes you wonder. After we finished our meals, I walked her to her car and thanked her for a nice night. She turned on the car, did a U-turn, and started going the wrong way on a one-way road, causing 2 cars to swerve, slam on their brakes, and blare their horns. I laughed so hard. Thank you very much for watching. If you liked the video, like it, be sure to write comments and share your stories.